Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the peritoneum, or the tissues that are connecting the digestive system to the abdominal and pelvic cavities. So the peritoneum is what we call a serous membrane. It's not because it doesn't laugh. It's a serous membrane because it is a membrane that contains vasculature and elements of the lymphatic system. It lines the abdominal cavity and it covers our organs. And this layer is actually a big part of what holds everything into space in place. So the peritoneal space lies between the peritoneal and the visceral layers. So the visceral layers are the gut layers. Let's just think of that. And then the space, the peritoneal space, is going to be the actual cavity itself. Now, one of the largest peritoneal serous membrane is called the mesentery and the greater omentum. The mesentery is a part of the parietal peritoneum. This attaches most of the intestines to the abdominal wall, and the greater omentum is also called the lace apron, and this is what hangs down from the stomach and holds the colon in place. Mostly the transverse colon, but this is the part that kind of keeps the large intestine where it belongs. And so if you look here at this picture, you can see where the liver is, the stomach, pancreas, duodenum, and so forth. The peritoneal space is all the yellow stuff. The green is what we call the retroperitoneal space, even though down here more inferiorly it looks like it's, inferior to the peritoneal space. It's still retroperitoneal because it's behind or posterior to the peritoneal space. Each one of these round spots identifies the lumen, or the hollow part of each organ, all right? So if you think about how the colon, all of the large intestine, small intestine are held into space, those would be the mesentery and the peritoneal tissues holding them and kind of suspending them in space so that they're able to expand when there's food going through them and contract when they're empty. So peritonitis is the inflammation of the peritoneum, and this typically comes from a bacterial infection or from a ruptured appendix. So this is where appendicitis can lead to peritonitis. When that happens, what typically occurs is that fluid will start filling the peritoneal space, and that's called ascites. Super, super, super uncomfortable. This causes extreme bloating of the abdomen, and in some cases of cancer, let's say cancer that's spread to the peritoneal or the retroperitoneal space, ascites can be, or the fluid, which is, ascites is fluid accumulation. Ascites can cause the buildup of fluid in the abdominal space, and it'll push up on the diaphragm and up into the thoracic cavity, putting pressure on the thoracic cavity and causing problems with breathing. Now, what's one of the big problems with ascites is not only do you have this increased pressure on the thoracic and abdominal cavity, but there is a problem filtering out with filtering out of the peritoneal blood vessels, which means that blood pressure goes up. And this causes problems with the heart rate, and it causes osmotic imbalances in the blood. So anytime you start putting pressure on blood vessels, that changes blood pressure in the body, and as a result, osmotic imbalances can occur. And that means now you have pressure, or I guess you'd put more responsibility more on the kidneys. Okay, so remember the very beginning of this lecture, I started talking about digestion. What is digestion? It is the breakdown of food. So digestion, the overall meaning, is changing foods such that they can be absorbed and used by cells so that cells can make energy. There are two types of digestion. I discussed chemical digestion, the breakdown of large biomolecules into smaller compounds that can be absorbed by the digestive tract and ultimately by the cells in our system to generate ATP energy through glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and ultimately the electron transport chain. That's chemical digestion. Before that comes the mechanical digestion, just chewing the stuff up, swallowing it, and breaking it down into smaller pieces via peristalsis and mixing with water and digestive juices. So peristalsis, those contractions that I've been talking about that move food down our digestive tract, it's not only to move food around, but it's also to mix the food with digestive juices and water so that chemical digestion can occur in the digestive tract. So carbohydrate digestion. Remember, carbohydrates are going to be things like glucose, fructose, sucrose, which is a glucose and a fructose glued together, starch, complex carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates are sugars. Sugars, they do start being digested in the mouth. In the stomach, they're not digested at all. There is no digestion of carbohydrates in the stomach, all right, because the pH is too low. Amylase can't work in there. Pancreatic amylase, however, when it's secreted into the duodenum, can then reduce sugars down to maltose, which is a glucose bound to a glucose, or it takes it all the way down to just glucose. Sucrose is digested with sucrase. Sucrose is a glucose molecule bound to a fructose molecule. Fructose, there we go, fructose molecule, and that's just basic table sugar. Our body loves the flavor of fructose. That's the thing that makes us want to come back for more sugar. Fructose on the scale of 1 to 100 is 110. Glucose, the flavor of glucose on a scale from 1 to 100 is actually 100. So fructose is detected slightly sweeter, and that's why we like it. Lactose is milk sugar, and that's a glucose bound to a galactose. Okay, glucose, again, used in glycolysis, citric acid cycle type things. Galactose, we cannot break down. Galactose is typically broken down by microorganisms in our digestive tract, in the small intestine and the large intestine. So galactose, as long as we just have a little bit of it around, feeds our healthy intestinal microflora. So that's carbohydrate digestion. Protein digestion. Now, what do you think about when you think of protein? Well, remember, proteins are chains of amino acids, long chains of amino acids, just bound to each other over and over, amino acids. And proteins have their jobs that they do, different jobs in the cell. Probably the most popular protein around would be chicken, right? Actin and myosin. Actin and myosin is found in chicken, fish, beef, lamb, goat. If it's an animal, it's actin and myosin. There can be some other proteins in there like, hemoglobin, myoglobin, connective tissue protein. But other than that, outside of animal protein, we do have proteins found in beans, rice. Soy is an excellent source of protein. Protein digestion itself starts in the stomach. So whatever you eat in terms of protein, first is mechanically digested in your mouth and then hit your stomach, where we have proteases called pepsin. Pepsin's the name of one protease. Renin is another one. And they partially break down proteins. They literally take the protein and make a cut in it. So instead of having a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chain protein here, amino acid long protein, now you have a 2 and a 3 chain. Then down to a 2 and a 2 and a 1 chain. Pancreatic trypsin completes the digestion of proteins into amino acids in the small intestine. So the small intestine is where the completion of protein digestion occurs. Intestinal enzymes called pepsidases complete that all the way down to amino acids. And so pepsidases work in the small intestine. Okay, trypsin is a pepsidase. Renin and pepsin work in the stomach. Fat digestion is the last biomolecule that we're able to get energy from. And fat digestion starts with bile. Now, bile is not an enzyme. What bile does is it emulsifies fats. It breaks fats down from a big droplet to little tiny droplets. So let's think about salad dressing for a minute. When you mix oil and vinegar together, they don't mix very well because it's like oil and water, right? So you have a big glob of oil sitting on top of the vinegar in your salad dressing. Now let's say you add a little bit of mustard and then you try to mix it together, and it separates out. The oil is able to mix into the vinegar because the mustard acts as an emulsifier. What basically happens is you have lots of droplets that started as a big glob breaking into smaller droplets suspended in water, which are my blue drops. Okay, usually the blue drops are separate from the big red droplet. And you have, in this case, let's make it yellow because that's what mustard usually is. Mustard allows the water and the fat to hang together for a period of time. Now, if you let it sit there long enough, of course, it'll separate out. But basically, this mixture here is called an emulsion, okay? And an emulsion is, you'll see this in culinary world all the time. So it breaks the fats up into really small droplets where pancreatic lipase, fat enzymes, takes the emulsified fats and break them down into fatty acids and glycerol. So if you look at a triglyceride, that is the fatty acid, Fa, and this is the glycerol. Both the fatty acid chains and glycerol can then be converted into other compounds that can be run through the citric acid cycle. So going back to this real quick, basically we're able to use carbohydrates, proteins, and fats as energy sources. Nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, we do not derive energy from. However, when we eat animal or plant matter, we do consume DNA and RNA because there's DNA and RNA is sitting in the cells. What happens to that? Well, our body's able to break those down and convert them to other building blocks for nucleic acid molecules like our own DNA, like our own RNA, and cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, and other things that you'll learn a whole lot more about when you get to biology and Bio-18 at Merced College. Okay, so how do you get all that stuff into your bloodstream? Now you've broken your carbohydrates down into glucose. You've broken your proteins down into amino acids. You've broken your fats down into glycerols and fatty acid chains. Well, now you have to absorb the stuff. And absorption means that you are taking digested food in their macromolecule building blocks and move them from the intestine into the blood or the lymph stream. And this is where absorption occurs, mostly in the small intestine for proteins, glucose, a little bit of fat, and water and fat are mostly absorbed in the large intestine. Okay, well, that's it. We talk about that a whole lot more in Bio-18 at Merced College. I could talk about this all day long because I like to mechanically break down food and digest it. I think it's a good time. And then I like to use it when I go exercise. Hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll talk to you soon.